Am I live? Hi everyone, this is For the Love of Comics. I hope I'm live, even though this is my third live stream. I'm still not very sure of what I'm doing, but if I am, anyone who's in the chat, please let me know. I see a couple of people. Hi, the comic board, welcome. Welcome to my little live stream. I think I'm okay. Now I guess I'm live. I don't know if I've just been talking to myself. Welcome everyone to For the Love of Comics. Welcome to our live stream here on the 20th of December. It's good to be on after a while. I've made a couple of videos. Hi Tommy, good to see you. Comic board, good to see you. Let's party, indeed. I'll welcome to the live stream. I like to ask people where they're watching from just at the start of the live stream while we wait for a couple of more people to join in as we're going live. And this is going to be my first live stream with a list. It's a shorter list than I usually make. I usually make top 10s, which is an excuse for me to actually talk about 20 or 30 books actually. But I'm only going to be talking about 6 books, kind of. Of course, I'm going to go over a little bit. Hi everyone. BT Productions, Rodrigo, good to see you. Ashwita, my wife, is on the chat as well. If you have any questions that I don't get to, hopefully she'll be able to answer. Plus, there are friends of the channels who will be glad to answer questions as well, I'm sure. Today's video is going to be a little different from what I have done before. Hello from the Philippines. Good to see you. And I guess I can start with a little bit of context. So what I'm going to do, another first for this video is I'm going to try to make it a little more structured than my previous videos may have been. So I'm going to try to stick to some sort of a rough schedule. I'll start by explaining a little bit about what this video is about, how it was inspired, what I'm trying to do in it. I'll give a couple of caveats and disclaimers on the parameters I used to make these choices, and then I'll dive into the books themselves. I know that in previous live streams we've had a lot of questions and answers and back and forth, and in this one I don't anticipate a general Q&A stuff, but I can answer questions that are related to these books or related to the kind of things that I talk about, which is the way that I'm choosing these books, so on and so forth. All right. Well, short summary of the 6 comics. Well, I will give you a summary of the 6 comics, and I'll talk a little bit about why I've chosen them. So hopefully that should come into play as I discuss this. So first of all, a little bit of context. The question of what would you grab in the case of a fire is, as I was saying in the notes of this video, a very famous kind of, it's a popular question to ask people who have collections, who have collections of anything, of if your house was on fire and you could only grab one thing, what would that be? Or if you could only grab 5 things, what would that be? And whatever your collection may be, to try to get to the most valuable or the most precious for you things in your collection. And that can be different things for different people. So it's really a question that is a gateway to a discussion on why and so on and so forth. And this was a question that was asked to me way back in my first Q&A video. It wasn't a live video. It was just the first Q&A that I did, I think, about a year and a half ago. And I sort of dodged the question there and then answered it by saying I would probably, in the case of a fire, first I said I would die of confusion because I wouldn't know what to pick, or I wouldn't really know what to sacrifice, which means that anytime you pick something, the rest of it's going to burn. So the idea of that itself may be too paralyzing for me to actually take any action. But I did conclude over there that I would probably grab some of the oldest comics in my collection. So not necessarily the most valuable, but the oldest that I've owned personally for the longest period of time since my childhood. And they're in very ratty condition, but I would probably bow to nostalgia and that sort of personal attachment more than anything else. And that was the way that I'd answered that question. Later, when I was thinking about it, I came up with different answers for myself, which is always the case. My friends who sometimes come and visit me have sometimes played this game that in case of a fire, and you're not here, what would I grab from your collection? What would I grab from your shelves? And that's another interesting way to play it. And it's something that I can play in other people's houses as well, where I say that, well, if I was here and this place was on fire and I could only grab one thing, I've done that with art collections that my friends have, where I'd say I'd grab that piece. It's basically saying that's my favorite of all the things you own. So we've got that. So we've got that sort of approach. A couple of weeks ago, maybe a couple of months ago, Noah Van Sciver had a similar question on his channel with him and a guest, and they went through the 6 books from each of their collections live, I think it was. But they went back and forth on what would be their 6 comics, the ones that they would save, and why. And inspired by that video, a couple of other comics YouTubers also made this video, the 6 comics I would save in the case of a fire. Earl Grey, whose channel I greatly admire and have mentioned a number of times on this channel, and who's very inspiring for me as far as my channel is concerned and the comics and the way that I want to talk about comics. His channel has been formative. He put a really interesting twist on this question by saying, instead of it being in case of a fire, which 6 books would you save, he made it if I had a short time to live, which are the last 6 comics I would read before dying. And I really loved this adaptation of that age-old question of this game. And the reason I loved it is because there are, obviously with most of these hypothetical questions, there are a number of ways to cheat, in which you really don't answer the question, or you take something. It's supposed to be a very subjective and interpretive thing, but you could easily make it a very objective numerical thing by saying, I'll take the most valuable comics in my collection. Or if you're not talking about comics, whatever it is, you start with the dollar price that it would fetch, the rarity of something, the difficulty you would have replacing it, which is this idea of everything burned, and I was able to save the things that I would have the greatest amount of difficulty in finding another copy of getting back into my collection, with this idea that, of course, you're going to rebuild your collection. So which are the ones that you would want to have as the foundation of that new collection you're building, even if it doesn't take on the shape of the other. So what I loved about Earl Grey's adaptation of this question is it takes those things out of the picture. The question of value, the question of how much will it fetch on eBay, or how much will you have to pay for it if you want to replace it, or how difficult is it to find. It takes that away, because if you're going to die, those things don't matter. You're not rebuilding your collection, and it's not about the rarity or the money or anything like that. And it makes it a much more personal experience, and regular viewers of this channel will know that I like that autobiographical approach in conversation with you, in the way that I like to make my videos. I like to talk about autobiography as being one of the driving factors. So this idea of what are the last 6 comics you would read if you know you're going to die in a month, and I'm not sure if Earl Grey mentioned a month or not, but that's where this comes from. So I decided to go with that and think about what would be the last 6 comics if I knew I had a month to live. What are the last 6 comics I would read? So that's a little bit of context as far as this would go. Oh, I'm glad to see a lot of comments and questions already. Oldest comics you own would be another video, absolutely. Yes, and Earl Grey, yes, killer YouTuber, says Comic Crack, who also made a video on these 6 comics, and it's very funny. It's very dry humor as well. But Earl Grey is really a great YouTuber. I've really enjoyed his videos. So my approach over here now is going to be this. So I wanted to put a little bit more spin on this because obviously, and I think this would be true for almost anyone, the first instinct I had was I would read my favorite comics, the ones I love the most, the ones I'm the most passionate about, the ones that have brought me the greatest joy, the ones that I've reread the most often, maybe. But generally, it would end up becoming a list of the 6 most essential comics as far as my comics appreciation, my comics reading, my comics journey is concerned. And that was my first and maybe even my second instinct. Then I decided to move away from that. And the reason I decided to move away from that, one, is because I think that's a different type of video, and I really wanted to make a slightly different video than what I would make if I said my favorite comics of all time or my top 100 titles or my top 10, etc., which I've long avoided, and I think I will continue to avoid because it's such a difficult question. But also because just the way that Earl Grey had taken an interpretation, just the way that Noah Van Sciver had taken a particular interpretation, I did want to have an interpretation on this. So I kind of started focusing on that if you know you're going to die part of it, and that sounds a little morbid, but I mean, it's part of the equation, it's part of the setup, so why not focus on that? So what I did do is, first of all, I'm not going to cheat. So I think with any, as I said, there are a lot of, there's a temptation to say things like, well, I would read new comics, which is also something I immediately thought of. It's like, why would I reread comics if I'm going to die? I would further my experience by whatever little I could at this point of time, and I would read things I haven't read before. But that's not really what the spirit of the question is. The spirit of the question is, I think, to try to excavate what certain comics mean to you, how they affect you, how they have affected you, and so therefore that's a little bit of a cheat. And it's sort of it's a realistic answer, but it's as realistic an answer as saying, well, if I knew I had a month to live, I wouldn't be reading comics. I would spend time with my family and my friends and my loved ones, or I would travel, or I would go mountain climbing or skydiving or whatever experience I haven't done, or I would try to get things off my bucket list, things like that. So I wasn't really interested in taking that sort of more cheaty approach or that more realistic approach. I did want to embrace the sort of fantastical aspect of this question. So that was one of the things that I decided I'm not going to do. I'm not going to answer in that way. Another thing that I decided that I'm not going to do is I decided I'm not going to take on or put on this list a huge long series. One, because I did want to think about it as, you've got a month to live. So I didn't want to take things that would unrealistically, that would take me more than a month if I put them all together. And I also didn't want to give the impression that I'm trying to extend my life by saying, well, if I don't die as long as I haven't finished reading, then let me just read all of these things. That means I just want, again, it's not really the spirit of the question. So for that reason, all of what I've selected here are single volume reads. And that's that was painful because I have so many favorite series and long series that are, and even if they're not that long, that are not just in one volume. And to cut them out completely felt difficult. But again, it's one of those things, we make these lists or we play these games in order to stretch ourselves. It's the equivalent to a physical workout, at least what I hear about physical workouts, because, I don't exercise. So it's a mental exercise. It's so for this purpose, I'm not going to be talking about any long series. I didn't select anything that is in multiple volumes. I've only selected things in single volumes, which leaves out, as I say, a number of my favorite books. And regular viewers of this channel will know some of them, obviously. But again, I'm not really picking my favorites either. And this brings me to the final thing. How I decided to pick these single volumes was not that these are my favorite comics. Although, of course, they are among my favorite comics, but these are not my top 10, my top 6 comics. These are not the best comics I've ever read, although they, of course, are among the best comics I've read. They're not the most emotionally gripping in certain ways. I mean, it's not that type of list, even though I completely understand why that would be the case for many people. Because, and here's what I was thinking about this before I die part of it, is one, I tried to figure out, aside from being, sad about dying or something like that, what kind of mental state I'm talking about if I'm picking the last 6 comics to read. And also, I left out anything that I love so much and I've reread so many times that they're like permanently etched in my brain. So this is the little cheat I allowed myself, where I didn't put anything on the list that I don't need to reread physically, because I'm kind of rereading it in my mind anytime I want to, because I have made myself so familiar, or because it's so ingrained. And this allows me to make a very different list than what I initially thought of, which is, what are the 6 comics I love the most, unequivocally, across all kinds of parameters. So that's where I think this list is going to be a little different. I'm going to talk about books that I have read more than once, because I usually read stuff I love, especially single volume things that I love. I usually read them more than once. I find that rereading aspect to be a lot of discovery comes from that, a lot of realization, analysis, whatever it is. Appreciation really comes from that second read. This is not always the case, but whenever I have absolutely loved something, I have read it more than once, eventually, if not, within the first 12 months of reading it for the first time, although that also has happened. But these are not books that I've read over and over and over again. So these are books that would still be fresh in a different way. I don't mean to imply things I've read a lot are stale, but there would still be an element of more discovery. There would still be an element of, I'd forgotten about that, or that is one little detail that had slipped into the cracks of my memory, and now I'm coming back to them. So one thing is that these are those kind of books where I've read them more than once, but I haven't read them and I haven't worshipped them as fully and wholly and as fanatically as I have some other comics that would be the ones I've read the most. And also, I think all of these are a little more reflective, a little more me trying to get to what kind of a mental state am I in and what am I preparing for. So without getting too I mean, this is not about what comes after life and all of that stuff. It's just like, now that I know that life as I know it is going to end, and if I have a certain kind of final act approach to these things, these are the books that I think are they're not plot heavy. For example, it's not about the action or the plot of the characters and what happens next and what happens next, which a lot of my favorite comics are. They're about the plot. They're about the story unfolding with plot playing a very big part of story. I think of as having many components all working together. Plot is one of them. I don't think story and plot is the same thing, but these are maybe more philosophical books. I don't mean to say that means that the books are about philosophy, but they're more about experience. They're more about a certain gentleness, maybe a certain introspection elements are a part of these books. And they're also about the kind of feelings that they've conjured up within me when I've read them, which is something to do with myself, my position, but also things that are bigger than me. I don't mean this in a religious sense, and I don't mean this in a sense of helplessness. It just means about the role that we have and the roles that we play, but the larger stage on which we play it. And as amorphous as that sounds, maybe it'll get a little clearer as I start talking about these books. So they're not my favorites. They're not the ones I've reread the most often. They're not the ones I have absolutely memorized and internalized. But they're not plot heavy. They're not about action as much as they are about the kind of feeling of examination that they inspire within me. If that makes any sense. One of the pieces of advice that Earl Grey gave in his comments to someone was, don't overthink it, which is the worst kind of advice for me, because I am a classic overthinker and I love overthinking stuff. But this is where I decided to stop overthinking stuff, where I just decided, okay, this is what I'm going to do. This is about the last 6 comics that I can read before I die. The last 6 comics I would like to revisit before I die, and how they will prepare me for the end. How I will, what will be the music playing if it were, if these books are songs or pieces of music. What is that I want, which I think is maybe a little on the gentler side, a little bit more on the transitioning from here to there sort of side, a little more a little softer, a little more dreamlike. And that's what I can find, I think, that unites these books. Although there might be more that I'm not getting, and you'll be able to spot. So that's it for the introduction, the context, and the caveats. Yeah, exactly. Just setting the parameters for now. All right. So Comic Boat says, to Gore Vidal, I spend a few months contemplating my death. And I think, I don't know if I spend a lot of time contemplating my death, but it's not a worrisome thing. It is as you say, over here, about perspective. So I like that idea of perspective, and I like that context, the greater context, which is also what I think about these books. They're books about context. So that's a good way to approach it. Okay, so let's get started. As I love to do, I'm going to start with a couple of honorable mentions, books that don't make this list but would have come very close. And a couple of these books did get mentioned by people who were discussing with me what their lists would be and what their titles would be, etc. 2 of them I do have over here because they were going to make it until the very last minute. The first one is probably the most obvious book, which is Daytripper. I think most of you know about Daytripper, and I've made a couple of videos on this comic, which I really admire and which I really love. And I know that a lot of people said Daytripper. I mean, there were commenters who said Daytripper would be on their list. My wife said Daytripper, and she said, "Oh, I'm sure you've got Daytripper on your list." So part of me wonders, did I take Daytripper off the list just because it was too easily guessed? And I'm like, no, I don't want to be predictable. I didn't choose Daytripper. That wasn't one of my choices. But Daytripper is, I think, a fairly obvious choice, not because it's not an imaginative choice, but because it's about death and it's about dying. I mean, every chapter is about death, and it's about life, and it's about the celebration of life through the context of this death, maybe, and with these sort of obituary and epitaphs that you get. But it really is a glorious celebration of life, and there is a lot of looking back on life or understanding life from a greater context and perspective, which you have as the reader. If the characters don't have it, or they don't have it in the way that you have it, because you're seeing the full picture, you're sort of it's sort of like Slaughterhouse-5. You're unstuck in time. You can see it at different points of time, but you can see this life that could end at any point of time, and you can see it continuing and not ending, and then what comes. So you can see someone meeting a girl but dying before anything happens. Then you can see another chapter in their life in which they have had a relationship with this woman, and then the end of that relationship. And then you can see them meeting someone else and again dying before anything happens. And then you can see them marrying that person and having a kid, and then dying before the kid grows up. Or then you can see them dying after the kid's a little age, or them dying as a kid themselves. I mean, the way that it shows life, the mosaic that it presents, I mean, for some people it might be sentimental, and for some people it might be boring. I heard people say that, and I can respect that opinion depending on the expectation one has. But for me, Daytripper is one of the most accessible sort of stories. I think most people can love it, and it would have been, and it would definitely have been in my list if it wasn't for the fact that I'm so familiar with it, and the fact that I have read it a number of times, and the fact that I was like, no, I don't want to be predictable. So Daytripper is one of my honorable mentions. But if you haven't, it's definitely a book I recommend and ask for you to check out. Yeah, it does belong on this list, and it is an obvious choice. But as I said, it's not an obvious choice as a bad thing. It's an obvious choice as a good thing. It is a sort of encapsulation. And Gore Vidal says that his good friend told him that Daytripper helped him deal with the grief of his father's death. And it is, I mean, I can completely understand that. I read this book after a couple of years this year, and some of you may know I made a short video on this. My father did pass away in January of this year, so that plays a role, I think, and that plays a part of it. It is a beautiful book, and certainly worth being on this list, as are many books that I'm leaving out. Obviously, this is all a question of how you test yourself. It's the main reason I'm leaving Daytripper out is just because I have read it a lot, and I created this parameter that let me try and put on this list books that I haven't read that much. And also, honestly, I mean, I'm because it's on a YouTube channel, something that I haven't talked about that much on this channel. So because otherwise it's very easy for me to, especially if I was talking about my favorites, it's like I've made videos on my favorites, and I've talked about my favorites on this channel and books that affect me a lot, or series, so then this list would be, well, Tintin and Usagi Yojimbo and so some of the things that I haven't talked about, and that have this kind of density. The second book that is an honorable mention, and the second book that I have over here, there were a couple of others that were honorable mentions, but I just didn't want to make this whole video about honorable mentions. But the second book is maybe, if I think about it, it is the thinnest book on this list. It's the smallest book, and probably the most plot heavy is I Killed Adolf Hitler by Jason, which I've definitely talked about admiringly in my Jason retrospectives and things. And this is maybe a surprising book for some people, not being as deeply philosophical and emotionally wrought as maybe some of these other comics, or many of the other comics in there. But for one, I think it is. I think Jason is very deadpan and is very even keel in his presentation, and that is a little deceptive. I think his work is extremely pregnant with emotion, but it's all sort of under the surface. So you can have like a very calm surface, even when he's showing violence, and even when he's showing all sort of absurdist hijinks, mashing up Edgar Rice Burroughs with Alexandre Dumas, with Charlie Chaplin, with Alfred Hitchcock. He creates these mashups that shouldn't work, but do. And then there is this sort of depth and this echo underneath in all his stories. And I Killed Adolf Hitler, on its surface, is it's a society in which hitmen are, being a hitman is completely legal and viable career choice, and people come and ask for people to be assassinated and pay for that. And the one such hitman gets hired to go back in time and kill Adolf Hitler. But the story is not about that, as in it uses that trapping. And the reason it almost made it, or is because how it uses this time travel shenanigans to tell a story that's actually about a relationship and heartbreak and being angry and carrying that within you, and then the passage of time and how that evens everything out, and how the gentleness of time can, if you give it the opportunity, sort of sand all these rough edges and these sharp edges. And that's something that I think I Killed Adolf Hitler does remarkably well, but not at all overtly. It has one of the best endings, and I don't want to spoil it, but I always want people to see the last page, because it's one of my favorite last pages in all of comics. But I don't want to spoil things. But suffice to say that sort of telescoping view of time, because of this time travel, because of the way this machine works and how you're supposed to operate it and what that means, and what people do in order to have the results that they're looking for, that's the kind of stuff that I think this book does marvelously. And very sneakily, because it's otherwise, it's easy to look at it as hijinks in trying to kill Hitler, and if things go wrong, what happens. And so I really found that part of this to be a very wise book. I found it to be a very gentle book. I found it to be very open-hearted and generous in its ability to look at people with their foibles and with their sort of base, very petty behaviors as worthwhile and as having redeeming value and features and things like that, all in this very, this tiny, and this is the hardcover, giving it some girth. The paperback is even thinner. It's this thin. So to be able to pack that all in, I thought was magnificent. Again, the reason I don't put this in the final top 6 is because I really, really love this book. It was the first Jason I ever read and got me started on reading and discovering everything I could get my hands on. And so it does have that nostalgic value as well. And that's another thing I forgot to mention in my caveats, so much for structure, is that I did purposely avoid a lot of nostalgic value. Not because I think there's anything wrong with that, especially given my appreciation of autobiography in comics reading and comics love. I think this skirts close because of how nostalgic I am for the start of my Jason love. But the reason I avoided nostalgia is because I felt that I wouldn't want. Actually, even though it's one of those first reactions that I think I would want nostalgic comfort in the last month of my life when I know after a month I'm going to die. I would want to return sort of to the beginnings of things and to look back on things with fondness and wallow in that. But then I decided that that's not actually what I wanted to do. I didn't want to value something only because of its association with beginnings. I'm not saying that Jason or any of those are, but I didn't. So I avoided my childhood favorites. I avoided the first comics I ever read. I avoided the first time I ever learned about something or introduced myself to a character. I avoided all those kind of things because I wasn't sure how much of that was because of nostalgia, how much of that was because of the personal association I have rather than the kind of journey I wanted to undertake just before just before I'm done with this life. So, if that makes sense, the fact that I am so familiar with I Killed Adolf Hitler, the fact that I've read it many times, and at this size, it's very easy to reread. Just getting ready for this video, you can read that, but it has an echo, it has a significance that lasts. But those are the reasons why I chose eventually to leave it off the list. There are a couple of others that I'm leaving off the list that came very close, and maybe I can discuss those with you in a separate video or discussion. Let's just take a look at the comments before I move on. Yeah, I think anyone who hasn't read Daytripper, yeah, if you're not ready to feel sorrowful, I think Daytripper definitely has sadness in it, but it's not a sad book. And I think I said this in my videos. I think it's a sort of glorious book. It ends up being a celebration. It ends up making you, and it's very unusual, and that's why I think it's a good example of artistic craft, because it definitely tugs on your heartstrings. It definitely plays to certain things, and it gets you emotionally because of certain things that you will respond to with sadness. But it's not a depressing book. It's not I don't know how better to put it than the fact that because it makes its focus so much on celebrating the life that comes before the death, that the death, as sad as it is and as tragic as it is in many cases, ends up being just part of it. It's just the punctuation, if as it were, of the story. The story is more about the life. It's more about the relationships. It's more about the things that you give. So I would definitely recommend Daytripper to a lot of people. But again, I know there are people who will not read or are wary about reading things that are absolutely going to crush them or make them very sad. And I think, I can think of several such books, including, I guess, what would be my first book in my top 6 proper, is Three Shadows by Cyril Pedrosa. This is a book that I read for the first time. Let's see, did I write in it? I read this many years ago, and then I went several years before reading it again. And I think for all the years that I've owned this, or all the years that it's been since I first read it, I've only read it 3 times, which, it's okay, but it's a fantastic book. It's a gorgeously, it's gorgeously drawn, beautifully written, fantastically composed comic by Cyril Pedrosa, in which there's a note in the back, and there's some context in which he wrote this book as a response to trying to figure out how to deal with, how does one process an incredible tragedy, an almost unprocessable tragedy. And again, much like Daytripper, this is something that is unbelievably poetic and lyrical. It uses the comic form, I think, in some of the most marvelous ways that I've seen, without being show-offy. The art is, liquid, but it's the entire story of parents and these 3 shadows that show up, and what those 3 shadows want, and what the parents' reaction to that is. The father's reaction is very different from the mother's reaction, and what that means, and the story that unfolds as a result of that. And this comic is, it is a poetically sad comic, and I think the reason why I pick it is because there is a definite it made an impact on me. It made a very deep impact on me. I would say, I think this is one of my favorite comics of all time. I've read a couple of Cyril Pedrosa Equinoxes and Portugal after Three Shadows, and I think there's one or maybe two more books that are now out in English, and they're and he's just an amazing writer, artist. Three Shadows remains my favorite because of the personal nature of the story, as well as the manner in which it depicts this quest that lies in the book. Whether it is a meaningful quest or not, whether it matters or not, and why it's being undertaken. The way that we struggle with life, and the way that we want to hold on to life, and the way that we may or may not have control over that, but that doesn't mean we're not going to try. It does not mean that we're not going to give it an attempt. I think has never been as magnificently expressed and as lightly presented as in Three Shadows. It's something that you'll really carry this with you for a long time, as I did and I have done. And I haven't reread this book. In fact, that's one thing about all of these books over here. I thought briefly, should I reread them before I make this video, before this live stream, and I didn't. I chose not to, because I did want to go by, why am I picking these books to be the last 6 books that I read? And Three Shadows is one of those where I was very tempted to actually read it again, and I was like, no, I'm going to just talk about it from the point of view of what I remember of it and what I would be looking forward to revisiting. So in the last month, with 6 comics, this would be one of them, because it's about that. It's about that last period. It's about what you can do, what good it'll do you, whether it matters or not, told from the point of view of parents and children, which is about all I want to really say about it for people who haven't read it. People who have read it will know, obviously, what I'm talking about. But if you haven't read Three Shadows, I really can't recommend it highly enough. I think the only time I've actually talked about this book may be in one of my shelf videos, and Shelf 3. It's published by First Second, so it would be a Shelf 3 video where I talked about how magnificent this book is. So that's the first proper choice in my 6 books to read before I die. Three Shadows is sad, yes. Blankets. Now that's interesting. I mean, Blankets is also a book that I considered. I think. So I don't have any Craig Thompson on this list. I don't have Blankets, and I also don't have the book that I don't have that was really painful for me to leave off was Asterios Polyp by David Mazzucchelli, because it seemed almost perfect. And again, I haven't read it that many times. I think I've read it 3 times as well, and it's a thick, dense book, and it almost made the list, but yeah, a little bit of a spoiler, non-spoiler. I didn't end up putting them on the list, particularly because I wanted a particular feel to it, and I think when I think about Asterios Polyp, as deeply philosophical and as wonderful as its examination is, the way that the story ends, it's really about rebirth, and it's really about resurgence of a certain type, which is one of the reasons I love it, and one of the reasons why I think it's fantastic. But I don't know if it was the mood that I was in when looking at these books. This is not to say that all of these books are sad books, or don't have anything in them. I'm trying to figure out the order in which I should go through them just to give the right impression. So the next book that I'd like to mention on my list, the next book is The Gigantic Beard That Was Evil by Stephen Collins. And this might be a sort of odd choice, although, once I thought about this and once I had decided to select this, it was a no-brainer for me. This is black and white, pencil etched fairy tale sort of book about a man who lives in a place called here, and then there is a place called there across the sea. And this is one of the most marvelous and magical books about conformity, non-conformity, fitting in, not fitting in, that I've read, because it doesn't seem to have any easy translation. A lot of the books that we read, a lot of the stories, and especially fables that we read, I think the allegorical connotations are sometimes they're very clear, like, this is good, this is bad, and that's fine. I mean, there is a power in that, in which you represent, and I think satire can do that as well. The gigantic beard that was evil is not satire. It's not allegory. It's not it's difficult to describe, because you can't really take any one translation of what this story is about, which is a story about a place in which nobody has any facial hair, or, they're all like sort of hairless. And one day, this man who works this job, in which you're not really sure what the job is, but he's looking at all these data points, and by looking at them, he starts understanding something. He sees something. He sees a pattern which he doesn't quite understand until he understands it, and then he grows like one hair on his chin, and that ends up becoming this beard that grows bigger and bigger. And then it's about what he becomes as a, I wouldn't say celebrity, but as a focus of attention in the town, and how the government responds to that, and what the dreams that he has, and way the beard, it's the gigantic beard that was evil, but the beard doesn't do anything evil other than grow and grow continuously. But that itself is enough to be classified as evil. Now, that's all just the sort of the fairy tale setup aspect of the story. What makes it a book for this list is that sort of undefinable aspect of its storytelling, as in, if it's not an allegory, and if it's not a satire, and if this doesn't represent that, and if this isn't really about that, and if this is not a commentary, what is it about? Which I find to be quite interesting when you read it, the way that it makes you think about the world and your place in it, and the place of this person, and how do people behave with each other, and how do people interact with each other, and are they right in doing it, and are they justified, and where does that justification come from, and what does it mean? This book isn't about all of that. This book is about the magical presentation of something that will make you laugh and make you kind of question the sanity of things that you're reading and seeing, all done in a very gorgeous manner. And with some of the most beautiful page layouts. And depictions that I've seen. There's a sequence over here of him commuting, and it's this kind of thing that makes you think that surely this is an allegory for something. I just need to find out what it is, find out what I'm missing. It's like everyone going on their commute, looking at their cell phones. So he ends up being the one person who looks out of his window. He ends up being one person who's looking out of his bedroom window in his house. So you're like, okay, sure, this is saying something about mechanization, or it's saying something about social media, or it's saying something, but it isn't. It isn't that easy, and it isn't that. It's just, this is the world. This is how people behave. This is what they're afraid of. This is how they create me and the other, and what happens when you cross that boundary, or what happens when those lines become blurry, and what is it that fear serve, what purpose does fear serve? Those are the kind of very heady intellectual questions that could come out of reading something that is actually like a very funny, jokey, almost fable or fairy tale. And it has a definite feel of sadness, but it's many, many, many layers beneath what comes across as ridiculousness, as almost comic, which I think is a very unique touch. The gigantic beard that was evil is not just a beautiful, fantastic comic as a reading experience, but again, like I think with most of these comics, it's one of those things that really stays with you and echoes. And because these things are not, the things that we're seeing over here are not about a plot and a preset arc, I think it makes it something that I would love to have as a as one of my final reads, in which that sense of mystery, of the sense of like, I didn't quite work that out. I didn't quite, fit A to B. I didn't make things correspond very directly, means that there is a lot more. There's a lot more to this, and there's a lot more to life than easy association or classification can let you know. So that's my second book proper, the Gigantic Beard That Was Evil by Stephen Collins. The Sculptor by Scott McCloud, I see in the comments. Yes, that's also... I really enjoyed The Sculptor. I made a video when I first started reading it because I was traveling, so there's one of my travel vlogs in which I started reading that, but that was about the time when I discovered that I really needed my reading glasses and I'd forgotten them, so I couldn't make much progress in that video. But yes, that is one of those books. Like, I'm actually a big fan of Scott McCloud's Zot as well, but The Sculptor it's kind of like Asterios Polyp, when it has questions about art and the artist and using that Pygmalion sort of idea to examine certain questions like that. Okay, next book up on my list is, and this might be surprising to some people, it's The World of Edina by Mobius. And I know that Mobius's Linkal is very famous, and I made a video on it, and I like it. But there's something about Edina, though, is that so weird and so magical and so... I think it's exactly the same way that a lot of people are affected by the Inkal, the Inkle. I still haven't figured out how that's pronounced, but this one, to me at least, was a more it was a more transportive experience. And I think it's because it's not like the story makes more sense or the characters have better motivations or anything like that. It was just that it had this that otherness and that weirdness is the trippiness, for lack of a better phrase, just worked better for me as far as me getting lost and me getting pulled into this book. There are obviously, I think, there are parts of it that won't be for everyone. And even when I was reading it, there were parts of it where I wasn't sure exactly what that was about. But I think what happened with this book when I read it was that I didn't care about it not connecting all the time as much as I thought I would. So the journey from this book, which features the obvious fantastic art, is that it made me feel as if I was somewhere else, but not just location-wise. It made me feel outside my skin. It made me feel outside my brain, which is, I think, something that Mobius can do with his artwork and with his layouts. He can really achieve that otherworldly, unworldly effect, and that's the way that Edina felt like to me. And that's another reason why I think, like The Gigantic Beard That Was Evil, that's why it makes my 6 books before I die, because I don't want everything to be cut and dry. I don't want everything to be simple and no matter what. That's why there's no noir detective story on this list, because no matter how clever, no matter how twisting, things are finite and bounded very finitely in most of those stories. And just at this point of time, with 1 month left to go, I don't want all the strings to be tied up. And the world of Edina, The Gigantic Beard That Was Evil, even Three Shadows, they defy a lot of, here's the beginning, here's the middle, here's the end sort of boundaries, which I think is the right kind of mood. That is the kind of mood that I would be in at that point of time, is to say that it's not just about this, and this, and there's like all this other stuff that I have no idea about, and there's all this other stuff that I'm thinking about and is affecting me in ways that don't always have to make logical sense. And that's why I think so many of these things are not about plot. So many of these things are fantastical. So many of these books are, sort of removed from a very direct prosaic reality, while having, of course, anchors in it, because that's the kind of approach that I was thinking of when I was thinking about 1 month left to live, the last 6 comics you read. Edina is Mobius's best work, says Comic Stripped. The Art of Edina by Dark Horse is amazing in explaining that, says Alawafsi. And I want to get Art of Edina, I guess. I'm usually, I'm a little wary about art books, because, it's bad enough having all these books to read and buy out there in the world. If I made art books a particular thing that I also get, it's just another Pandora's box that I don't want to open. But I have in the past strayed from the straight and narrow and bought art books just because I couldn't resist it. I got some Miyazaki art books recently, for example, that I showed on this channel, which I just couldn't resist. So maybe I will have to do that. I did enjoy Inside Mobius. I mean, it's a little more personal and in his head, and I didn't mind that, actually. But Edina, I think, is the perfect balance. I agree, and like, at least as far as what I've read, I think, and I haven't read that much Mobius, and part of that is because so much of Mobius is unavailable to read in English, or even in an edition that I can afford. So I'm definitely not saying it's the best thing he's ever done, but in my experience, this is the best thing of his that I've read, because of all the reasons that I just talked about right now. Okay, now moving on. What should the next book be? I've gone through 3. And I've got 3 left. The next book on my list is A Distant Neighborhood by Jiro Taniguchi. This, again, could be one of those choices that could get tinged by nostalgia, because this is the first book of Taniguchi's that I ever read. This is the book that introduced me to the creator who's fast become one of my absolute favorite comics creators. I talked about The Walking Man in a relatively recent video. I just finished Summit of the Gods, and I had The Guardians of the Louvre. I talked about that in another way. Anything by Taniguchi that I've read is astonishingly good. He's one of those creators that I feel, that I have with certain people, where I feel like, oh, they're doing this, specifically for me. They're just, it's like, I don't care if nobody else likes them. I love them. I absolutely worship them. And A Distant Neighborhood is where it all started, and and the reason why it's on this list is also because I think it kind of holds up beyond that, just that personal attachment to the first book of his, because I've loved every book of his. So I'm not really going to give precedence or more value to one over the others. But it is exactly that kind of, I mean, The Walking Man could easily have also made this list in the place of A Distant Neighborhood. I just went with A Distant Neighborhood because it's been longer since I last read it. Walking Man is a more recent read, so again, because I'm thinking of that gap, and it's a story of, it's not quite like that George Bailey. It's a Wonderful Life. It's not. It's not like that, but it's a man. He works a job. He goes to the office. Takes train back and forth. Goes home, etc. That's his life. Then one day he just gets on the wrong train and heads out of town into the distant neighborhood, the neighborhood of his childhood, of what seems like a previous life. And again, I don't want to spoil this. This is a superb book. It is as musical as it is poetic, but it feels very real while being a fantasy in many ways. It has a lot, I think, like all these books, like what I was talking about with Jason. It's like you've got the surface, and the surface is still, and the surface is calm, and what's underneath the surface and what's being talked about is beautiful. So it's this is Taniguchi's work. For those of you who are not familiar, is very clean, is very clear, and his writing and drawing work together marvelously in ways that I can just hold up as the prime example of how comic storytelling should be marrying these two things. The way that this story unfolds is, again, it's like the gentlest movie, while also being something that is very much about the act of reading it. So I'm not doing a very good job because there are things that I don't want to, spoil about it, but really because, like with most of Taniguchi's work, it's very difficult to describe. You sort of have to experience it, and the manner in which you read it and the manner in which the page sort of opens up to you while you're looking at it is part of what makes it so wonderful. So when you read The Walking Man, these walks that the protagonist goes on are part of the story, so sometimes he's walking in the rain, sometimes he's walking in the park, sometimes there are kids playing around him, sometimes he's lost within crowded streets. But the other part of the story is him, his looking around, him observing things, him looking at things. And it's the same way with The Distant Neighborhood. You've got the neighborhood, you've got the people, you've got the behavior between those people, but then you've got the protagonist. And of course, at the end of my life, looking back on my life, the mood that I would be in would also have to do with different things like the roads not taken and the choices made, not necessarily with regret, but as an exercise, as a culmination of your experiences. And this notion of those experiences and how different those experiences could have been, where the choices we make in our life, where they lead us, what we would be able to do, or what we able to not change, but what would we think of differently, I think has never been done in the way that it's done in A Distant Neighborhood, which is, as I say, gentle. It's not abrasive. It doesn't hit you over the head with something. It's not trying to teach you a lesson. It just is. And then as you read it and as it unfolds in front of you, you take from it the kind of the kind of experience that you will. This is interesting to me because, I mean, apart from the story, this edition that I have it's a sort of westernized edition, so it's not like most manga where it comes from that they flip the pages and it reads in the way that we're used to reading American, European comics in this way. And this is one of those examples where it didn't really affect me, because I've not read it in any other form. Most of the manga that I've read is the other way around. You start over here and you read this way, and I usually have no problem with that, because as soon as you know what you're doing, you get used to it. But at least using this as an example, flipping it around and putting it in this way did not affect my reading of it in any adverse way. So yeah, so that's a Distant Neighborhood by Jiro Taniguchi, one of my absolute all-time favorites, and one of my 6. And let's see, what do we have? Any Summit of the Gods? Yes, Summit of the Gods is I think it's 6 volumes. Yes, it's 6 volumes, and it's superb. I'm not a mountain climber by any stretch of the imagination. I barely like hiking, but I've never been interested in mountain climbing. I've never quite understood mountain climbing, and Summit of the Gods, which is all about climbing mountains and mountain climbers, is magnificent. It's terrific. I mean, I'm not saying that I'm going to go out and start climbing mountains tomorrow, which is probably a good thing, but I get it because of this comic, not because of the way that the story. It's just what Taniguchi, I think, is really good at, is putting you into the skin of a very human experience, irrespective of the context, irrespective of the milieu. And we've seen that with cultural things in these stories, which may have to do with a marketplace or a city. They're just very alien from anything I've seen, but it doesn't feel alien. And it's the same thing with Summit of the Gods, is that it stops feeling alien and it feels absolutely transportive. Metabarons I've really been meaning to read. I've heard it's very good, and especially when I made that Inkle video, I heard a lot of people recommend to me to try out the Metabarons, and said that I would probably like it better than I liked the Inkle, which I liked. I just didn't absolutely love it. So I'm really looking forward to reading the Metabarons soon. There's a particular edition that I'm waiting to get my hands on. All right, now 2 more books left. The next book on my list is Here by Richard Mcguire. This is a book that I think took a long time to make after the initial short story came out. The short story was published, I think it was a 6-page short story in Raw magazine. It would have been in the 80s, I think. And this is probably, I mean, with Richard Mcguire's Here, what I would think is, either you've never heard of this book, or you've heard of this book being very highly praised. You may not agree or something like that, but it's sort of like those are the poles, as it were. There isn't something like, oh yeah, I heard that sort of mention, and people were like, might be worth checking out, etc. It's really an astonishing achievement in comics, and I've wanted to make a video on this, but it's also the most lean in certain ways, especially as far as text is concerned, of any of the comics over here. What Here does, and I'll give you the conceit very quickly. This is the space that you're looking at, right? So say you, even within the end pages and stuff like that, you're getting to this space. This is, say, a living room in a house. And from the very beginning, you're looking at this living room. Like for over here, you saw the window, the couch, and the fireplace. So when you turn it, there's the window, couch, fireplace, bookshelf. Right. So the book never moves from this, if you want to look at it as a camera angle. It never moves from this fixed camera angle. But what you've got in places, so for example here, if you look at it, you've got a year, 2014. When you turn the page, it's 1957. So that's the same room in 1957. That's the same room in 1942. So you just keep turning the pages and you're seeing the same space. So it's just going back in time or going forward in time in that one rectangle. So you're seeing this living room change by going back and forth in time. 2007, right? So 1957, something we've seen before. And there you have. Now, what is remarkable about this, I think, is here, 1999. This is 1957. This is 1999 in the same space. So $19.99, that's the cat. 1957, 1423. And this is, I think, as much as I want to spoil the book, because I can see in the comments people saying it is, the people who've read it, it's a unique experience, and it is a unique experience. It's time, telescopes forward and backward, and panels within the larger frame keep changing which year you're seeing in which space. So they start merging and going back and forth all across time. By that, I mean, it's not just, you go to prehistoric times, you go into the future, but without changing your camera angle. And the sort of accretionary effect of turning these pages, of looking at these panels, of noting the dates. Sometimes people are talking, you read the speech balloons. Sometimes those speech balloons are truncated or amputated. Sometimes and you're only seeing fragments of certain years, and then you're trying to associate this with something you may have seen of that time or something along that time. You start building up a picture in your mind of when was this house built? When was this living room built? When did they put the fireplace in there? What existed before there was a house? What existed in the 15th century? What existed at the time of the dinosaurs? It becomes an incredibly, again, transportive experience in which the thing that we were talking about right at the beginning, context of who we are and the relative position we occupy, not just in space, but in time, using the comics medium is electric, honestly. And I didn't select here because it is a magnificent work of comics formality or the formal use of comics vocabulary, although it definitely is. I selected it because of its ability to transport me outside of my skin. I mean, it's not an exaggeration to say that this is a book that can give you goosebumps, can make your hair kind of stand on an end, but it also makes you feel dizzy. And I think that's what the world of Edina does. I think that's what the gigantic beard that was evil does. It kind of makes my head spin in losing firm footing on where I am, what I think of myself, and what I think of the world around me, and how much bigger are things, and how much broader are things, and how much deeper are things that we sometimes may think about. But these are the kind of works that I feel really do that. They really expand outwards and inwards. They have that effect of giving much greater context and therefore a very different kind of clarity. I don't mean assuredness, I just mean more things exist than what we know or what we think of. Again, not religiously or magically, just from the point of view of experience. And that's the kind of stuff that I think, with 1 month left to live, that I would be reading. That's the kind of stuff that prepares me to know that this is not all there is, and that is not all there is, and that it can be anything and everything in such magnificent ways. So philosophical, but not in the text, because there's nothing in this telling you how to read it. One of the most amazing things about here is how it relies on you, the reader, to just sort of go with it, to figure it out. And it's not rocket science. It's not that hard to figure out. You know where the room is, you know where the space is. So when you're looking at something that says 500,000 BCE and you see a window within another panel that says 1932, the clothes people are wearing and the atmosphere and the geological features that you're looking at, they all come together to tell you one story, even though the elements of the story are separated. And I think that's that's one thing that this comic does magnificently, just the way that most of these comics do that, including Daytripper, where multiple elements separated by space, separated by time, are actually part of the same narrative, is the kind of philosophical bent I think I would have leaning towards. I would be leaning towards at this time where I have 1 month left to live. Well, yes, and here and there, because of these jokes about here and there in the comments, I just there's another association, because here and there are the two places in the gigantic beard that was evil. So this is the story of here. We don't know the story of there. We just we're sort of afraid of there and what there contains, and we're very happy to have this ocean or the sea between us and them, or between here and there. Okay, and now for the last book, which so just as a recap, for those of you who've joined later, right at the top, I talked about my disclaimers. I gave a little bit of context of why I made this list. I talked a little bit about how I made my choices and what I lean towards. And the books we've gone through right now, Jiro Taniguchi's Distant Neighborhood, Richard Mcguire's Here, The World of Edina by Mobius, The Gigantic Beard That Was Evil by Stephen Collins, and Three Shadows by Cyril Pedrosa. And as as I said before, all of these are a little ephemeral. They're all a little, I mean, if not philosophical, they all have these kind of fairy tale, fabulist, timeless, area-less kind of thing. The most grounded perhaps has been A Distant Neighborhood, which also has some of those elements in it, but as trappings. And my final book actually is the complete opposite of that. It's a very realistic piece. It's very much set in a very definite time and place with specific characters interacting in our world. And I don't think I've talked about this outside of my shelf videos. This is The Now of Brown by Dillon, which I think is it's not number one in a ranking, but yes, this is the final. And the reason I left it for the end is because it's not quite the same tone as the rest. This takes place in a very concrete world in London. Beautiful watercolors by writer-artist Dillon, telling the story of this young woman and her life. And I guess you could, I think the easy way of classifying a lot of these stories, I just want to keep showing you the art on this, of these watercolors. The Now of Brown is just a terrific story about being human and living in this world that we live in. So this is not a fairy tale. This is not magical. It's but it is magical in many ways, because it's about this woman and this young girl, not young girl, a young woman, this young woman and the people she meets, the kind of issues she has. She definitely has some psychological problems, but they're not manifested so overtly as to require institutionalization, for example, but they're more internal, and they're things inside her head. And it's contrasted, these kind of things of violence inside her head, it's contrasted to her actual existence, which is gentle and beautiful and full of art. And she's sort of introverted, and she has compulsions, including something that I really appreciated, where she takes all her Tintin books and she arranges them by the color of the spine, which Tintin fans will know is not the order in which the adventures take place. But it's not just about OCD, or it's about connecting. And I think the reason why this book makes it is, one, because, as I said right at the beginning, I haven't reread this as often as I would like to. I think I've only read this twice, and I've had this book for many years, but the last time I read it was maybe 3 years ago. So I think I want to reread this again. But it had that effect on me. It had that effect of echoing and me thinking about the story and me thinking about sequences in it, but not just a page or a panel or a spread, but about the way the story unfolded for many, many weeks after I'd finished reading it. Because like many of these stories, like definitely Daytripper and I Killed Adolf Hitler and Three Shadows, I mean, like all of these stories, it's very open-hearted. It's very generous in the way that it treats its characters. It takes them whole. It doesn't say this is great except for that part, and it's just like all of this makes a human, and all the human beings in the story are like that. So even though it isn't fabulous, even though it isn't a fantasy, it does feel gentle in the way that many of these fabulous stories do. It does feel a bit fairy tale-ish, even though it's grounded very much in our world and the kind of problems people face and the kind of existences they have are they are bounded by our world's issues, but within their relationships and the way they find, it sounds a little cliche perhaps, but the way they find meaning and the way they find not redemption, because no one's really a sinner that needs to be saved. It's not that melodramatic. It's that gentleness of human connection and the gentleness of the love between people in spite of the things that they have within them that keep them from being perfect is just terrific. I mean, I don't know if I'm doing a very good job talking about the Now of Brown. I don't know if I'm doing a very good job talking about any of these, but the story of the Now of Brown, the story of this young woman, is one of the most emotionally affecting stories that I've read in comics. And the way that it looks at life, and not just her life, but life around, is one of the things that I thought of when thinking about books for this list. Because at the end of my life, with 1 month left to go, what I hope I would leave with would be this notion, with these ideas that everything can be beautiful, even if it isn't perfect, because thinking about perfection and beauty is incorrect. And the way that our connections with other people, that we share our city with, our space with, our arts with, our hobbies or our passions with, is really where the beauty comes from. So that, I think, is very gently and very non-lecturally put across in all of these books, not just the Noah Brown. Yeah, the gentleness of the connection in the story. Yes, and I think that subtlety is something, again, in all of these stories. It's It's really, and one of the reasons why I love comics, the reason why I love comics is because of that level of interactivity, the level of agency that you and I as readers have. It's not just a passive, like I'm going to sit here and just have everything wash over me, although there are elements of that for sure. But I still have to work. I still have to take that juxtaposition. I still have to read between the panels. I've got to understand what's happening in the gutter. But I'm also responsible for the pace. I can decide how long I want to stay on this image or this page. I can decide when I want to turn. I can decide if I want to turn back and look at it again. And the best comics are designed for that kind of experience. They're not designed to be a movie in which, one frame replaces the other and you sit there and with nothing to do about it. It's not like so many other art forms. I mean, again, I'm not comparing art forms. I'm just saying the power of the reader's interaction with what the creators have crafted is what I appreciate. And that's why I like subtlety, is because there's no reason to beat me over the head with things. I have an equal power, or maybe it's not equal, but I do have power. I do have the power to slow down. I do have the power to turn back. I do have the power to step back or zoom in, and so therefore the way that these 6 books, as well as my honorable mentions, not just these 2, but the other ones I mentioned, the way that they succeed is that they really trust the reader. They respect the reader, and they are able to put this stuff out there in a way that the reader's participation enhances the experience. And that's really, I think, the big reason why these books make my last 6 books before I die, because I still get to be involved. I still get to, affect the story that I experience, and get these kind of visions of what reality is, of what existence is, of what life is all about, including tragedy, including sadness, including pain and loss, because that's not just unavoidable a part of life, but that's really what you're headed towards, right? When you've got a month to live, you're talking about the biggest loss, or the biggest transition away from what you have known there is. And that's why these are the books, I think, that help me think about celebrating what it is that you've had, and the incredible diversity and the incredible complexity of that. Even if you never experienced it all yourself, knowing and acknowledging the presence of those things becomes a really good way to say goodbye. At least I think so. So there you have it, my 6 comics before I die. Of course, if I reread these, I might change these 6 comics. So maybe this is something that I can revisit every couple of years or so and see if they've changed the way that many of my lists change, and many of these things, which is the whole point anyway. So I'm really glad all of you joined me. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the wonderful words of support and kindness. Hello, Kolkata Chele online. This was a great little exercise, but I'm always fascinated by everyone who comes on and chats with each other while I'm talking, just like maybe I'm just on in the background while the real conversation's taking place over there. So thank you so very much for joining me for this list of 6 titles. Thank you so much for all the support you show this channel, and for showing up to watch all of my little homemade videos. It's been fantastic, and I'll see everyone in the next video. Thank you.